Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for a new show from world famous Film Fanatic headquarters. Hope everyone's doing good. It's a Sunday morning, so yeah, nice weather. It's a little bit warmer today. Still snow on the ground, so it's cool. So yeah, today's show. This is pretty impromptu. Like literally, I thought about this show this morning. I was watching a video. There's a couple of guys I usually follow quite a bit on the old YouTube that do film reviews, and I really a couple of things that they talked about. This one guy in particular, it really stirred up my head a lot. And I originally I was going to do a regular film review, which I will do for another video. But I was watching this one particular video, and basically this guy was talking about who I like. I like his stuff, and his name is Cody Leach. He's one of the bigger YouTube guys. He's pretty huge. He tends to mostly it's a horror channel, and he most of the time does well. His primary focus is like newer horror, but he also covers lots of different things. But it's all horror oriented show, and it's pretty good. There's there's some things about his show that or at least the coverage of some of the videos that he does that I don't really agree with, and I'm kind of like amazed sometimes by his viewpoints. But out of total respect to him, I think he's great in a lot of ways, and he definitely is a powerhouse. At least seems to be a powerhouse on YouTube. But there's certain things about that he talks about his views that I really I don't know. I'm kind of at odds with, but at the same time, there's plenty of things. I don't want to ever live in a world where everybody has the same opinion because the world would be really boring and even more lame than it is. But one thing that I talk about a lot, and obviously all the videos that I cover, most of the videos, about 90% or 95% of the videos that I cover, my channel is primarily like I know I'm small potatoes and I'm just a dude or a guy who loves horror films, loves collecting movies. I don't make any money off of this channel. I don't have any Patreon. I'm just, you know, I just go by my instincts and my love of film. That's all it is. There's nothing more to it. If this channel grows to a point of where I'll I can make money off of it and have a little source of income, that would be cool. I'd be open to that, and I'd be excited by that. I'd like this channel to keep expanding like it has been. But it's to me, I don't really care about that. I just look at this as just you know, uh, an outlet for me to talk about the movies I love, and that's it. And the main focus being if people out there, and I know there's a lot like the horror genre. I think as a whole, the horror genre is probably bigger now than it's ever been. But one of the main focus of that idea, or at least from my show, is, say folks out there, whether, they're maybe relatively new to the horror genre, or say if they're into, you know, uh, quote unquote, more Hollywood based horror films, but they have a deep love for that. What I like to do is to try to always maybe, I like to take deep dives in certain things. I do that with music too, but I like to do that with this channel. I like to do that with film. So what I like to do is to trace the origins of like where maybe the slasher genre came from, or where the earliest versions of the use of say practical effects in horror films, and exploring European horror cinema and diving deep into the exploitation world. Because I feel like a lot of those movies are obviously very trashy, but they also were hugely influential on a lot of the films that are out now. I think James Wong's movie. who was responsible for a whole bunch of more modern highbrow horror films. I think that movie was very much an influence, or was very much influenced by a lot of the classic '80s kind of Italian horror films, but it's a modern movie. And I thought that movie's okay. It's pretty decent. I don't think it's necessarily an awesome movie, but I thought it was cool. It was definitely retro and it had something different, but it had a lot of influences from a lot of the films that I cover a lot, particularly around the Italian horror world. You know, Lucio Fulci, Bruno Mattei, Dario Argento had that classic '80s vibe and a little bit of that exploitation kind of vibe. But it's Malignant is a newer film, you know, a very commercial horror film. So what I like to try to do is to like dive into, and then another example is say Quentin Tarantino. Obviously, a living, breathing encyclopedia of movies, but he's tremendously influenced by all kinds of films, and particularly in the grindhouse world of cinema and the exploitation world. So one of the things that I like to do, or try to set out to do, is like if people out there like those films or like those directors and other films that are, you know, or say newer horror films, look at trace back the origins, and to explore the films that might have started this kind of horror legacy, by predating a lot of these films by say almost 40, 50 years. And so if you really love horror, science fiction, horror films and science fiction films, take that deep dive and plunge and see where that, maybe where that seed was first planted. So that's, and to maybe open up the world to other films that you could love and maybe cherish that really were probably influential. Like say if you're a huge a fan of the Friday 13th franchise or the Halloween franchise, check out some of the movies that probably played a big role in influencing Sean Cunningham, who created Friday 13th, or John Carpenter, who created Halloween. So that's the focus of the channel, really. And you could be, and I think if people check out some of these exploitation movies, they'll be like really surprised. Wow, this is where this stuff comes from. But one of the things that I have a problem with Cody Leach is he seems to not give things certain props, and he has this cutoff thing, and he doesn't. If he doesn't like, and I don't think it has anything to do with whether you like something or you don't like something. It's about giving some kind of respect to those filmmakers or to that genre. And I realize the exploitation world, the stuff that I love so much, my favorite genre. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but I think a lot of these directors, for what it is and for what it's worth, deserve props and thumbs up for at least being kind of to a degree pioneers in this genre that we all love now. They were doing these kinds of films, and also Herschel Gordon Lewis. They were doing these kinds of films before anybody else was. So, and I know it's not, definitely not everybody's cup of tea, but I think what those guys did in their careers and their huge legacy of films deserves respect, whether you like it or not. It has nothing to do with that. And I feel like what Cody Leach does is he doesn't, if it's a film or a director or a certain genre or time period, if it's something that's maybe not his bag, he won't give it props. He'll just dismiss it. And I think that's kind of a crappy thing to do. But hey, everybody's got, different opinions. My favorite quote is from, Larry Flint. He was the founder and publisher of, was a Hustler magazine. My favorite quote of his was, opinions are like assholes. We all have one. So, but Cody just talked about this new batch of movies that he just got of newer releases on Blu-ray. And the first movie he talked about was Smile, which came out last year. And I just did a show recently on Smile. And it was directed by Parker Finn. And it was a major Hollywood horror film, big budget. It was released by Paramount, distributed by Paramount Pictures, and I just did a show on that. And he was talking about how he just went out. He had seen Smile at this big festival, and he went on and on about how much he loved this film, and he thought it was one of the better films. He said, to a point, he did criticize it and say, well, it has this level of where it's a story that you have seen before, and and because it's the formula of the story, or the way the heart and soul of the film functions, because it is something we've seen many, many times. He felt that can take away from the film, but nevertheless, he still has like billed this movie as being one of the greatest horror films to come out this year. And I don't really, so that got me really thinking. And then another film he just covered is The King of Comedy, which is an older film that I just recently saw, that was directed by Martin Scorsese, then stars Robert De Niro. And it was a movie that for some odd reason, I never got a chance to see it. I and when I finally did see it, and I saw it fairly recently, I just kicked myself because it's an amazing movie. It came out in 1983. It stars Robert De Niro, and it was directed by the legendary Martin Scorsese. So it was interesting that the first two movies he talked about were those two films, and I think so. It made me think about movies that sometimes try to capitalize on successful movies, or and also the situation or circumstances sometimes where films will just totally rip off another film. And so with Smile, I talked about that. I did a show on that very recently, and I also did a show a few months ago on the King of Comedy. King of Comedy, I just think is such an amazing film. I have no idea why I never saw it before. I love Martin Scorsese. He's one of my favorite directors. I it was one. It's probably the only film I never got to see for some reason. And I also think it's one of the greatest roles of Robert De Niro's career, especially when he was younger and he was like really, just firing on all cylinders, and he was just, just a lion, one of the best of his generation. But the thing that's funny is, like, when I did the show on Smile, there were things about it I thought were great. It was highly suspenseful. I thought the opening was pretty brutal and intense and pretty riveting. But when it got into the story, and as the film unfolded, I liked parts of the film, but I talked about how it it within about 20 minutes of that film, I started thinking right away in my head, this totally, in every way, story wise, reminds me of this movie called It Follows, which I actually did a review on also. And I did a show, like I said, on It Follows to tie in the whole scenario with Smile. So within 20 minutes, I was watching Smile. I just, like I said, I just kept thinking, wow, like the story it's strange. Like it kept occurring to me while I was watching Smile. It's strange how much this movie reminds me of that storyline from It Follows. And as the movie progressed, you know, it's about it's roughly about a 2 hour movie. Smile's about 2 hours or so. And about an hour or I should say close to the third act of the film, I I was like, I started like I was into the movie, but then I felt like I was being pulled out of the movie. And I'm like, no, wait, no, this is the same story as it follows. And I found myself being taken out of the movie. And I watched it, knowing, feeling that way, and it was really strong. But I still wanted to see where the film was going to end. I still wanted to see what the conclusion was going to be for Smile. And I was really kind of disappointed with the ending for that film. The biggest problem that I had was it felt like it had two separate endings for Smile. And it felt like there was a second ending put on the film that felt like it was just kind of tacked on last minute. And the first, or what I would like, and I went into this in in great detail in the review I did for Smile. But I felt like the first, for example, the first ending felt okay. It felt pretty conclusive. It felt like okay, things have come to a closure. There's resolve, and it was pretty definitive. And then within a couple of seconds, suddenly there was this switch, and then you were put in this place of like where suddenly I felt really awkward. Like, why is this film still going? Why? Wait, I thought it was over. And then suddenly there was this switch where this other second ending came in, and basically, you were kind of made to believe that, well, no, that really wasn't the conclusion. The main character, which is centered on this mother character, who's kind of like this, I don't know, almost takes on this element of some kind of demon or elemental, force of evil. Suddenly was alive again, and suddenly was all powerful, and at that point it had this even even more of a cliche ending. I had problems with the first ending. I thought it was okay, but I thought this other ending was, they tried to make it into this like surprise, kind of thing that was going to happen at the end, and try to like, maybe pull the rug from under you. But it felt even more cliche and really cheesy, and it was very disappointing. You know, but and I've talked about it before. Like sometimes when you see a film, you get a lot of times I don't really think about films or art or music or whatever it is as like an intellectual thing. I kind of base it on just how I react, the how I feel emotionally after I see a film or during a film, if I'm excited or if I'm like distracted or if I'm feel like I'm invested in the film, or which happens too, you feel like you're just you're having this experience where things are just kind of glazing over you and nothing's really sticking with you. And then a lot of the times I find your kind of your first overall, like your first reaction to things is kind of how you'll feel about that particular thing. Like whether you like the first time you hear an album, say by a band that you really love. Like say there's a band that you really love and they put out an album and you've been following their career for a while, and you put their album in, and you have this experience, and whether it's good or bad, most of the time, that initial feeling will stay with you with just how you react physically to it and emotionally. And I think with film too, it's the same thing. Like you'll get a reaction, during certain key points of the film and when the film's over. And generally, that is usually how I find for myself is how you'll carry that impression of how or that will really determine your opinion of that experience. But there's also those experiences, which is a little bit more rare, but I find that definitely happens, of where you sometimes have to sit on something for a while, maybe give it 24 hours, and then maybe the next day or 2 days later, you suddenly have a totally different experience around it. And you're like, oh wow, like it could go either way. You'd be like, your initial reaction was like, oh, I really enjoyed that, or I thought that was very cool. And then the next day after you've sat on it for a while, you're kind of like, I don't really, there's nothing about it that I'm really thinking about. I'm not feeling like I'm clinging to anything around it anymore. And it just is kind of forgettable. Or it's happened to me too, vice versa, where I was like, okay, that was pretty cool, or that was different, or that was interesting, but I'm not totally sure. Like, I don't really have a definitive opinion on how I feel. And that's perfectly fine. But then, say you're in that situation, it's happened to me many times. The next day or two, you're like, oh, wait, you wake up thinking about it. And then you're like, holy shit, that was pretty awesome. Like that was actually really good. But generally, I think your impression is, kind of, it's immediate. It's there at the forefront of how you react to something. I think two examples of that for me, where I had these two big changes or flips on how I reacted, was for the movie Terrifier. Terrifier 2 is this big independent horror film that's come out with Art the Clown. Super low budget, but it's made all of this money and it's huge. And I have not seen it yet, but I wanted to see the first Terrifier. That was an example of that, of where when I watched it, I was impressed with a lot of those things in the film. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty good. But then the next day or two, I found myself with this feeling like that I had just eaten a bunch of like cotton candy, or a bunch of like fast food, or I don't know, where initially it tasted really good, but then afterwards I was not craving to have it again, and I wasn't nothing stuck with me, and I realized, well, that movie, it's like and this again, this is my opinion. I felt that experience, it was void of any like substance or anything that had lasting power, aside from the insane kills. There was no real atmosphere. There was no real characters. There wasn't any characters that I even thought about again, and I had no craving to like watch it again. And I just kind of, I don't know, just kind of dismissed that movie as a movie that's overly hyped and just you know kind of pointless in a lot of ways. I think it's great that those filmmakers have made something out of nothing and are very successful. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the experience of making quality work. And since then I lost any kind of desire to see Terrifier 2. I probably will eventually see it, but so I had this totally flip. Like my reaction, I had this completely different reaction. It was like a 360, and that was an example of having to um, you know um, kind of let it sit with me for a while. An example of where immediately I had this reaction out, and I was just like, "Holy shit! That this was awesome and amazing." Another example of that, or an example of that, would be Ty West's X, and also Pearl, the prequel. When I first saw those films, I immediately was just like totally sold, and I thought these movies are just so original, so interesting, great balance of all of the elements that I love about horror. And also, when I saw those films, particularly X, when I saw it in the theater with a group of friends, we were talking about it, and we kept talking about it after that, and for days afterwards, we kept talking about it. It was a thing of conversation, and immediately I had this reaction like, this is a modern classic. And then another example of a film that like you like at first, but you're like a little bit indecisive as far as maybe having an opinion of it. But then the next day or two, it does resonate with you big time. Uh, which I was really and so an example of that was when I saw Top Gun Maverick. I had heard a lot of great things about that film. I knew one friend that had gone to see that film multiple times in the theater. And I like the original. I mean, it's a classic 80s movie. I like Tom Hanks, or sorry, Tom Cruise. I think Tom Cruise has been in some great films. But I heard that this movie was really great. And a couple of people that I follow that are reviewers on YouTube had said that it was one of the best movies they had ever seen in the last, five or 10 years. And that it was better than the original. And so I did see it. I watched it on DVD, and I liked it. I thought it was really entertaining, and it had a little bit more substance than I had expected. And the characters were really good. I thought the action was breathtaking. The locations were amazing. I was generally into it. I thought it was pretty good. But I still like was trying to sit with it. I was just sitting with it for a little while. And then I noticed like the next day or two, I kept thinking about it and then thinking about it more and more. And I was like, you know what? That was kind of an outstanding movie, like really good. And I was kind of blown away by how I reacted to it. So those are just like examples of how you kind of react to things. But generally, it's usually, at least for me, it's usually how you react right away. And when I saw Smile, that happened with me as far as like I had a lot of issues when I watched it. I had issues with the film when I watched it, but then the next day, I couldn't help but think that wow, that this movie is literally a ripoff of It Follows, like the actual storyline where it's centered on this kind of this evil force that is transmitted from person to person through like intimacy or some kind of physical contact. With It Follows, it was through sexual intimacy. But I couldn't believe how much it literally was, and that's the centerpiece of the story. And I couldn't believe how much it just ripped that film off. And It Follows, I feel I really love that movie. I think it's one of the better horror films that's come out in the last 15 or 20 years. It came out in 2015 and it was directed by David Robert Mitchell. And the strength of It Follows is, I don't think a film has to be, so incredibly original or just give you this like, uh, you know, uh, it has to present everything in this totally innovative, lens for it to be good. I think if it's a good story, it's a good story. But I think It Follows was such an original horror film, and I thought the whole from top to bottom, I thought that film was really giving you something new and unique. That as a hardcore fan of horror like I am, I had never really seen anything quite like that before, and I felt this film was like totally original. It was just steeped in such great atmosphere and suspense, and it just had something about it that was, for what it is, was really innovative. And it wasn't like any other film I had seen during that time of when it had come out initially. And since then, I'd never really seen anything like it. I thought it was a really unique movie and a great horror film, a great, trip to the amusement park. And I thought Smile, everything about the story, and I started feeling that way more and more after I had seen it. After a couple days had passed, I just kept thinking more and more, geez, this movie Smile just completely ripped off It Follows, and I have lost any kind of fire or enthusiasm about Smile now because of that. It made me, after I watched Smile, it made me want to watch It Follows because I'm like, no, this is like this is, you know, this is a better movie. And it was interesting too. I went out to dinner a few nights ago with some friends, and a couple of my friends, Aiden Kaczynski and Emmett Layler, we're kind of like movie buddies, and we all, we've watched a lot of movies together and stuff, and particularly horror films. And it was funny because Katrina or Kat, Emmett's girlfriend, who's also really into horror films, and we've seen movies, the whole group of us together quite a few times. We were talking about horror, it came up again as it normally does. We started talking about horror films, and Katrina or Kat had brought up Smiles, like how much she really really liked it. And I said, yeah, there were things about it I really thought were really cool, but I just, after a day or two of it, I just could not take my head away from the idea of how I felt that movie was. The story was such a ripoff of It Follows, so it like just totally took me out of the movie. And my friend Aiden also said he was a little bit more harsh about it, but I think he was right. He said, "Well, no, it just that was a total ripoff of that film, so it wasn't." He kind of just dismissed the film entirely. In my opinion, since I saw Smiles, has moved more into that area of where I'm just kind of like distancing myself from that movie more and more. So it's a funny thing how that the process. And again, these are all just my personal opinions. So so the other example of this, like I said in the start of the show, is the Joker and the King of Comedy. Real interesting. I had such an interesting and strange experience around watching the King of Comedy in regards to the Joker. Now, the Joker, I'm a huge comic book fan. I love all the Marvel movies. I've done a bunch of shows. My favorite aspect or part of, or my favorite group of films for the most part in the comic book universe are the Avenger films. And I've done shows on those. I have, you know, pretty much all of the Marvel movies that I really love. I have, most of those in my collection on Blu-ray. So I've done quite a few shows on those films. I'm more of a Marvel guy. I do like DC. Batman is my favorite character of all time, and he's a DC character. I do love. I did a show on the Justice League, the Snyder Cut, which I think is an awesome movie. But as a whole, I'm more of a Marvel guy. I feel like the Marvel universe is a little bit more consistent. But at the end of the day, my two favorite characters for me that are completely iconic are the Batman, and my favorite villain of all time is the Joker. And so I was really interested and super excited when I saw that there was going to be a Joker movie. But I kept thinking, with the legendary performance, that was brought of the Joker that was brought about by the late and fantastic actor Heath Ledger, with The Dark Knight, which is just such an iconic movie, and there's Jack Nicholson was great in the Tim Burton version. I mean, he's awesome in that. But there was something so epic and that brought elevated that character, that characterization of the Joker to new heights. And I've had like my friend describes that movie, The Dark Knight, the Christopher Nolan movie, as being kind of the Citizen Kane of comic book movies, and I think that's a pretty accurate thing. When it was announced that they were going to make more or less a standalone film, like an origins film about the Joker, starring Joaquin Phoenix, I was like, wow, how are they gonna? What are they gonna do? Like, I know Joaquin Phoenix is easily one of the best actors of his generation, and he's just one of the greatest actors around. Period. And Todd Field is a really great director. He's got some great films, but I'm like, wow, how are they going to do this? But then I was really excited. And then I saw it, like most people did. Todd Phillips directed it, and it came out in 2019. And I was just blown away by this film. Blown away. Um, it was, you know, I think the definitive definitely earned that title of being truly a standalone film. Like it was a movie that I felt was so good and so well done that you didn't need to, you could go into that and not even have any clue or idea of like what comic books are or the Joker or anything, in that universe. You could go into it as just wanting to see a movie, and it was just a riveting experience. Super intense, super dark. And after I was blown away by that film, and it was one of my favorites. And it still is. And when I started to, kind of do some like research about the film and digging into like, how they created this film, I started seeing interviews with Joaquin Phoenix, Todd Phillips, the director, and and Robert De Niro was in this film, and I felt like this was one of his best roles, also, that he's ever done in many years. And I've always been a huge De Niro fan, but I always felt like the later part of his career, he kind of became a parody of himself. He didn't really, it felt like he was doing all these movies as pure paychecks, and he wasn't really bringing the goods anymore. I think like the Joker was truly an exception of how, or an example of what an incredible actor he can be or was, especially when he was younger. And then also Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, which is an amazing movie, and he's just so great in it. But anyway, as I was like checking out, about the Joker and like what they were they their the influences. I was mainly looking into like what like influenced that film, because it's really gritty. It's so dark, and right away it did remind me. Like Martin Scorsese is one of my favorite directors, and it really reminded me of a Scorsese film. It reminded me of like Mean Streets for some reason, because it's a a big budget movie, but it was really raw and it was really kind of dirty and grimy. And Mean Streets is like super raw and just in your face and just has this like real confrontational thing about it. And it reminded me of that. And to me it like had this Scorsese vibe, and that was one of the things that I loved about it. But yet it was something new and unique. At least I thought at the time. And as I was checking out, digging into doing searches on, interviews with the people involved with the film and the cast and Todd Phillips, the director, I started hearing more and more about where Todd Phillips was talking about. Well, basically, he had said that, and I believe it's true, that Martin Scorsese actually helped finance this movie. He like produced it and put his own money into it. And I was like, oh wow, like that's interesting. And then I was like, huh, well I see his influence in this film big time. Like it has a Scorsese film. And as I was diving into it more, I started seeing where Todd Phillips was talking more and more about that Scorsese was the body of work of all the classic films that he's done, and as a whole as a director, he felt like that he was a major influence on crafting the Joker. But then he kept talking about this one particular movie called The King of Comedy that he felt was a really big influence, like the main movie that really influenced the Joker, and really was a key point in kind of the narrative and the direction of the film. And being that like I've said, Scorsese is one of my all-time favorite directors, I realized like when that kept coming up in interviews, I had never seen The King of Comedy, and I was like, Jesus, like why haven't I seen this? Because it came out. It came out. The King of Comedy came out shortly after Taxi Driver, which is one of the most iconic movies ever, directed by Scorsese, starring De Niro. And I had heard of The King of Comedy, but for some reason, I heard about it in passing here and there, and people had said that this is a really great movie. And people were talking about, like, in you know the and throughout the years I've always heard about it, and I had always heard that people have said that this is a really, classic Scorsese movie that no one's really seen. No one ever talks about. It's usually all the time, all that whenever people talk about Martin Scorsese's career, they always talk about Goodfellas or his mafia movies, Casino, um, and Taxi Driver. So many great films, but they generally talk about those films. But a lot of when I kept hearing about the King of Comedy, people were saying this movie is truly a masterpiece, and that it's totally underrated, and it was very different from any of his other films. But it was, basically a lot of times people would regard it, or the way they would talk about it was they were saying it was like a, totally underrated film in his whole canon of films, and in his world of filmmaking. So I'd heard about it, but when I was doing these, taking these deep dives and listening to these interviews about the Joker and with Todd Phillips, that came up, and it kept coming up more and more, and I'm like, oh, damn, I need to see this movie. And then, so finally, I remember at Opera House Video. It's a funny story. I went, the video store I go to, owned by Dennis Howard in Belfast. I talked to him about it. I went in there once, and we were talking about the Joker, and I had said, "Have you heard about this movie, The King of Comedy?" And he's like, I haven't seen it either, but I heard it's really good. It's one of those movies that people talk about, but not really. And it never is a movie, that's really brought to the table as far as one of the great Scorsese classics. It's kind of this, odd movie in his career. It wasn't, I don't believe, like, commercially it was a hit. It never got really big acclaim. It was, it came out and it was kind of forgotten about. And so Dennis had not seen it either, and then he ended up buying it for the store. He ended up getting The King of Comedy, and he ended up ordering it. And then, so then a couple of months ago, I went in there and I rented it, and it was my first time seeing it, and I was really excited by it. And about, but the strange, and again, this is so similar for me to, it's a direct parallel, and it's totally tied together with how I started off the show with talking about Smile, and it basically ripping off It Follows, to where I can't even really give that movie any kind of credibility, because it was such a gross example of that. I feel like in my own weird world. So it's a direct parallel, I think. So I ended up watching The King of Comedy, and the same thing happened. We're like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half hour into it. I'm like, what the hell? Like, this is literally the Joker, like the storyline. And then by the conclusion, and I loved it. I thought it was an amazing movie. I was just blown away. I thought this is one of the best. And De Niro was really young in this film, and I thought, again, like, it came out right around the period that Taxi Driver came out, so he was like in his late 20s. He was in his strong. It was the strongest part of his career, and most consistent. And by the end of it, I was like, that movie was just amazing. Like, it's now one of my favorite Scorsese films, and I can't believe I've never seen it. But at the same time, I was like, all this talk that I've heard about this film, particularly around the Joker movie, where Todd Phillips was talking about how this movie was an influence. I'm like, no, it wasn't an influence. I'm like, my first reaction was, you guys, like, totally ripped this fucking movie off, like, from top to fucking bottom. Like, it's literally the same fucking movie. And I couldn't believe it. I was just like, I was dumbfounded by how the story was literally identical to that. I thought, okay, this would have an influence. Like, you'll see the influences of that movie. I had already seen influences, or felt the influences from Scorsese's work in this film because of the grittiness. But it went way beyond that, where I was just like, this is literally the same fucking movie in every conceivable way. And particularly around the main character of De Niro, where he's this like kind of this delusional, self-absorbed psychopath, and you're it's like a character study of this guy basically losing his mind, and then he crosses all these lines and boundaries, and before you know it, he is like this dangerous character. And there it gets so hard into the whole thing of where you don't realize, or you don't really know if if his mind is placed, the scenarios in the film The King of Comedy, of where is this all like kind of in his head, or are these actual things that he's actually experiencing. And it did a brilliant job with exploring that, and also toting that line of where you're not really sure if this is all in his head or if this is in reality, or vice versa. And I thought that was the biggest strength of King of Comedy. But that being said, the Joker completely, the narrative of the entire story and the journey of how he becomes the Joker, how Joaquin Phoenix becomes the Joker, because it's essentially an origins movie. It was identical to that narrative, identical, top to bottom, and I was in it, and so it was a weird reaction. Like, I love King of Comedy, but I found myself now, and that was the thing that I loved about the Joker, was I thought it was so original and innovative, and it really was a story like I've never seen before. I thought it was totally original. But since I've seen The King of Comedy, I have like lost a lot of respect for the Joker. I still think it's a really great movie, but now I know, and I haven't seen it since I've seen The King of Comedy, but I know now, watching, when in the future, if I'll see it again, or maybe I'll buy it, it's going to be impossible for me to not think of The King of Comedy, because not only was it an influence, obviously, but it was a complete and utter ripoff. So it diminished it. Now it's evolved to where it's diminished my appreciation of the film, and I don't regard it as high as it was. And I highly recommend, because I know The Joker was a hugely popular film, very popular film. I mean, Joaquin Phoenix won an Academy Award for it, just crazy, and it was a huge box office hit. But I highly recommend anybody and everybody out there who loves that movie, like I did. I highly recommend you go out and see and rent The King of Comedy, or stream it, or whatever you guys do these days. Because for me, it was just like total like WTF moment. I was just like, no, this movie is a total ripoff of this movie. And it's totally diminished my view of it. It's such a weird experience. And I feel like, so there's like parallels between the Joker and Smile, even though they're both very different movies. But the stories, and how I feel systematically both of those films have like ripped off other movies in a way of where it was just, it's so blatant and so obvious that for me it just takes you out of the movie, and it makes me want to watch the original films of those, King of Comedy, what that is to the Joker, and it follows what that is to Smile, where like you look at those two films, like I think those are amazing films and so original. So it's weird. It's such a weird experience. And I think too, the other thing that's funny about it, and on the other side of the things, most of the movies I have on this show and the coverage that I do are about exploitation movies, and exploitation movies are all about kind of exploiting a market, or capitalizing on other films that are popular. Like, say, one of the best examples, or examples of that, is, say, when Steven Spielberg's Jaws came out, and I've talked about this before. one of the biggest, one of the greatest movies ever. I love that movie to death. One of the best horror movies ever. But it was an iconic, movie that just, just went on to make so much money. And on the exploitation world, another movie that is really a direct ripoff of it, where filmmakers went out of their way to say, well, we want to make Jaws on land. An example, the biggest example of that is one of my all-time favorite exploitation movies is The Car, starring James Brolin, and that came out a couple of years after, and it's a direct ripoff of Jaws, like it literally is. Another movie too that's kind of a hugely influenced and to a degree ripping it off is Bill Luswig's Maniac. They were such kind of ripoffs of Jaws, and so I love films that do that. I love the exploitation world. And another example, which is probably my favorite exploitation movie of all time, is Tourist Trap. It did that with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is also one of my all-time favorite movies. That movie completely ripped off Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But the thing about, I think that's different than, say, I don't know, using terms is always funny, but looking at like the highbrow Hollywood movies, like the big budget Hollywood movies, versus, when they rip off other movies, versus in comparison to, say, in the exploitation world of where it's part of the business of it, where that's like kind of the business model in a lot of ways, is ripping off and capitalizing on other movies. When I watch exploitation movies where that is just a known thing, I enjoy them. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't get under my skin. It doesn't take me out of that movie. And I think it's because with the exploitation world, like if you look at The Car, for example, or like Maniac, or even Tourist Trap, exploitation movies that were ripping off movies that were, say, quote unquote, big budget Hollywood movies or commercial hits. In the exploitation world, these guys and girls who are making these films virtually have no budget whatsoever. The acting isn't really that great. The effects are really downgraded because they don't have the budget that a lot of these big films have. The acting isn't as high of a caliber. They can't do 100 takes of each scene. It's like this weird guerrilla version of that film, and they at times also have a real silliness to them and campiness to them because they're so low budget, and they tend to be really gritty and kind of dirty and on the sleazier side of things, and it just has this like kind of nastiness to it, and it's really raw. And I think because it swings so much in that direction, even though, like, say, for example, The Car is like a total knockoff of Jaws, it totally has its own thing, because of all of those elements, and it's not, clearly doesn't have all of those attributes at its disposal. So because it's like this guerrilla version of it, it just has this great grittiness to it, and it makes it for a fun experience. It gives it a real fun, pulpy kind of flair. It gives it a real pulpy flair to the film. So to me, it's like, in some ways, I almost enjoy the exploitation versions of certain films because of the nature of that beast. But when I see, like, say, highbrow films of where they, use all these top-notch actors, and they have this, unlimited budget, and it gets, this distribution, and those films tend to be very serious. Like, they're taken very seriously. They're meant to be taken seriously. So when that happens, of where they rip off things, to me it doesn't have that charm that the exploitation world would have. So it's interesting. But so this was the topic I really wanted to talk about today. The differences between you know, well, films that are just rip-offs of other films, and the difference to a degree in the world of exploitation compared to, say, big budget Hollywood films, on how, to me, they're very different. But yeah, but I definitely say to anybody out there, check out those films. Check out Smile. Definitely watch it. But I think you should start with watching It Follows. And also watch The Joker first, and then watch King of Comedy. I think it will blow your mind like it did mine. It will just change your whole concept of what you thought that movie was. So this is Jason Dean. Thanks again. I really appreciate people checking out this channel and showing some love and support. So we will see you next time. Peace.